Hello, my name is Gabriela Heck. I am a PhD student in education at Pontifical Catholic University of Rio Grande do Sul in Porto Alegre, Brazil, and I'm here with my advisor, José Ferraro, to present our work called Science Education for the Deaf, the use of the museum to promote the popularization of science. This work is part of my master's dissertation and aims to understand how the science museums can promote the popularization of science. We focus on deaf visitors through a case study conducted in Brazilian museums. To contextualize, teaching science to deaf students in Brazil represents a challenge in Brazilian schools, considering the lack of sign in the Brazilian Sign Language, causing the scientific exclusion of deaf students in the process of learning and teaching science. Considering that, teaching science to deaf students can make use of complementary resources, like science museums, because those are informal educational spaces that act on subjective aspects and allows the construction of collective identity, allowing the inclusion and consequently the popularization of science to deaf community. Also, those spaces can arouse the interest in science, becoming allies for science education aimed at deaf students, since they have a strong visual appeal, favoring discussion about scientific content. To promote the inclusion and consequently the science education to deaf visitors, some authors suggest that museums can afford the presence of fluent employees in the sign language, the presence of guide interpreters for the deaf in the exhibitions, the presence of video guides with sign and subtitle explaining the exhibition, and the presence of sign writing explaining the exposed collections. To understand how the science museums can promote the popularization of science, we focus on deaf visitors. We developed a case study, consider interview with 3 professionals that work in Brazilian science museums and attend deaf visitors. And it was analyzed by the analysis content that results in 4 categories, namely measure of accessibility, visibility, exclusion factors, and access to knowledge. In resume, the first category addressed measures related to accessibility in museums, and we identify 4 intermediate categories within the category 1. The first intermediate category is accessibility measures, which address aspects related to attitudes, activities, and efforts to allow accessibility in the science spaces that can promote the access to knowledge and, consequently, the popularization of science. Another intermediate category refers to the specialized service that is dedicated to the deaf visitors. For this service, it should be considered, among other things, the realization of qualification and training with the employees, as well as addressing issues related to their behaviors toward deaf visitors. In order to allow the application of some accessibility measures, it was considered relevant to establish partnerships with institutional and employees who can assist in the development of inclusion activities. And to conclude this category, it is also important to discuss opportunities for deaf visitors to work in those spaces that are the result of the accessibility measures adopted. The second category brings together aspects related to the visibility of the deaf community and the Brazilian Sign Language, and is divided into 3 intermediate categories. The first is representativeness, which is perceived when there is a recognition of the deaf person and his needs in these spaces, and which is reflected in the attitudes that are taken when attending them. Another intermediate category, called personal motivation, is also part of visibility, as it discusses the process of searching for knowledge and the motivations and personal concerns that the employees had and that make them seek accessibility measures. Finally, the intermediate category called disseminations address alternatives for reaching the deaf community through the dissemination of science measures on websites, apps, advertisements in order to reach the deaf audience and thus make inclusion activities efficient. The third category addresses the exclusion factors considered by the participants, which is important to identify the barriers that reduce the accessibility and, consequently, to the access of science knowledge, as well as the attitudes that demonstrate prejudice and lead to exclusion. The lack of accessibility and visibility were the most frequent exclusion factors, in line with the communication difficulties resulted for this lack of accessibility. Some impediments were identified as exclusion factors, such as the closure of activities aimed to the deaf community, the lack of interest from organs and employees in popularization of science measures, and the high cost of certain activities, which end up being closed due to investment difficulties. Finally, it was recognized that prejudice is one of the exclusion factors while preventing the visitation and excluding this community from cultural and scientific activities. Finally, the fourth category addresses issues related to access to knowledge. This category has two intermediate categories: the popularization of science, which bring together the statements related to measures to explain access to science through the dissemination and popularization of science, and the subcategory expansion of access, which brings together aspects related to frequency of visitations and measures to expand the access on informal educational spaces. To conclude, in this work, we approached the issue of education for the deaf in Brazil, and we realized that even with the advances, the scientific education process is compromised due to the greater investment in other disciplines, if not science. As discussed, this results in the restriction of the inclusion of deaf people in the scientific field and the deficit of development of new science in the area, which causes difficulty in teaching science, leading to the scientific exclusion. From those considerations, we highlight the importance of using visual and spatial elements in the education of the deaf, and the use of different educational spaces, such as the science museums, to assist the process, as they have the visual and interactive elements necessary for the education of the deaf people, in addition to addressing the scientific content in a playful and interactive way. Furthermore, we realized that from the scientific bias, Science Museum can contribute to the education of deaf community in Brazil through activities aimed to social inclusion, through science, by the popularization of science. The content analysis allows to identify the relationship between the activities carried out in science museums and the researches on popularization of science. With all the considerations so far, we believe that it was possible to recognize how Science Museum can promote the inclusion of deaf visitors through activities of popularization of science. But we also recognize that more research is needed in the area of the inclusion of deaf people in the scientific field, in addition to projects from the inclusion of this community on informal educational spaces, such as science museums. Here are the references used in this presentation. And thank you all for the attention. Any doubt, please ask me or send an email to the contact in the slide. Bye.